Hi, this is Billy Joel, and I'm against apartheid, and everyone I know is, and if you want to know about what's going on, watch South Africa Now.
Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now reports these stories. Free at last. While Nelson Mandela remains in jail, 7 of his comrades are being freed. We'll tell you who they are and what the releases mean.
I think it is important, this release, but I don't think we should read it as a reason to relieve the pressure on the government. In fact, I think it's a reason to increase the pressure, since the pressure has brought this result.
The African National Congress is fighting to transform South Africa. What do they think about the prospects for peace? We'll talk to ANC leader Thabo Mbeki.
There is a continuing confrontation between the democratic forces, liberation movement in the country, against the forces that are determined to perpetuate apartheid.
And in our culture section, a musician named Frank takes on apartheid. You'll see her new video.
Bloodbath in the land of Zolabud, murder in the land of...
All of these stories and more this week on South Africa Now. But first, the latest news.
Dumelang. Free at last. Prison doors have opened for some of South Africa's best-known prisoners, including African National Congress leader Walter Sisulu. The releases sparked off some of the largest demonstrations in South African history as 150,000 people marched nationwide in celebration and defiance. The releases, which the government said came after discussions with Nelson Mandela, were the lead story in the white South African press. They are also being seen as a test for the release of Mandela himself, whom the freed prisoners demanded be let go.
Sisulu was greeted at his home by euphoric supporters who were carrying banners and singing songs of the banned ANC. It seemed to some observers that at least for one day the Congress had been de facto unbanned. While there was joy, many view the move as a gesture aimed at influencing the upcoming meeting of the Commonwealth nations in Malaysia. They are threatening to impose tougher economic sanctions against South Africa. Stuart Sender has our report.
While Nelson Mandela's plight has overshadowed that of other prisoners, Walter Sisulu has also been an African National Congress leader of tremendous stature. The 77-year-old Sisulu, who was the ANC's Secretary General, was jailed in 1964 for conspiring to overthrow the government, along with Mandela and 6 others. His family is South Africa's first family of protest. His wife Albertina, a prominent anti-apartheid leader, was invited to the White House earlier this year. Their son Zwelakhe is the restricted editor of the opposition newspaper New Nation. Another son, Max, is an economist for the ANC who lives in exile. He spoke about his father early this year.
But from what we hear, his health is very good. He writes very good letters, very encouraging letters. Even when we feel a bit down, when we read his letters, we say, here's an old man who's been in prison for, better part of his life, 24 years in prison. He still comes out, fighting for the liberation of his people. And it makes us, also take up the struggle, and it encourages us.
The announcement of the release coincided with the United Nations Day to remember South Africa's political prisoners.
On this day of solidarity with the South African political prisoners, I renew the earlier appeals I have made to the South African government to lift the state of emergency and to release Nelson Mandela and all other political prisoners. And I was relieved to learn yesterday that a decision has been taken to release Walter Sisulu and 7 other political prisoners. But many other leaders representing the majority of the population are still imprisoned, in detention, or subjected to other restrictions on their freedom because of their political convictions.
Among those present, South African lawyer George Bizos, who represented Walter Sisulu in the now historic Rivonia trial.
There are many more political prisoners. President de Klerk has promised justice for all. His credibility will be placed in issue if he stops there and the jails remain full of political prisoners who, after all, did what caused their imprisonment because of their abhorrence of apartheid, which he, President de Klerk, now says he wants to dismantle.
Much of the talk about the release of Sisulu and the others focused on the upcoming meeting of Commonwealth nations.
The releases are timed to coincide with the eve of the Commonwealth summit meeting that will be taking place in Kuala Lumpur. Therefore, it is our feeling that the South African government, in an effort to try and deflect international pressure on it, is releasing these political prisoners in such a way as to ensure that sanctions or greater sanctions are not imposed against South Africa.
Also to be released is Jeff Masemola of the PAC, who had been held the longest, sentenced to life in prison in 1963.
He has demanded that his release should be unconditional. There is no doubt that he will now link up with our president, who was released last year, Zafania Matupeng, and continue to work for what he believes in and for what he has already sacrificed a quarter of a century of his life.
And Raymond Suttner, a South African lawyer who has spent years in jail for his work in the anti-apartheid movement, offered this analysis.
We must ask ourselves, what is the reason? Is the objective of the apartheid regime to achieve a non-racial democratic South Africa? There's no sign that that is the case. I think what we are seeing here is a form of crisis management, where de Klerk is adopting a different way of containing the aspirations of the majority. I think it is important, this release, but I don't think we should read it as a reason to relieve the pressure on the government. In fact, I think it's a reason to increase the pressure, since the pressure has brought this result.
Also this week, a meeting of church leaders with State President de Klerk brought major media attention. All three U.S. networks focused their cameras on the discussions between de Klerk and Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the Reverends Allan Boesak and Frank Chikane, billed as a precursor to negotiations. And two of the networks, NBC and CBS, picked up an important twist. As these talks about talking were taking place, they reported that police were using tear gas to break up a peaceful demonstration.
What the networks didn't say was that while the meeting was significant, the government still has a long way to go before negotiations can take place. In this statement, the church leaders presented these key points to de Klerk: lifting the state of emergency, lifting restrictions imposed on the political opposition, releasing all people detained without trial, unbanning political organizations, releasing all political prisoners, and a moratorium on the death penalty. In addition, the church leaders called on the government to begin negotiations with liberation movements, including the African National Congress, within 6 months.
Political prisoners are not just people who have acted against the state. Some are young men who refuse to act for the state as soldiers. Recently, 400 draft resistors and supporters marched to a military base in Cape Town where they placed flowers on a cannon. 6 were allowed to enter the base and present a letter signed by 770 people who refused to serve. Recently, we spoke to 2 South African draft resistors who are living in exile in New York.
The thing that really made my decision was just a revulsion of the way what was happening in South Africa, and the way the army was used to put down unrest in the townships, and the way the army was used to defend apartheid, really.
During 1984, I got to see a lot of the police action during the elections for the tricameral parliaments. A lot of the military raids on neighboring states took place in that period. And I'd come from a very conservative government high school, and it was a big eye-opener for me, and it affected me very much.
I'm Joseph Disho with Namibia Watch, our weekly report on the United Nations Independence Plan for South African-occupied Namibia. The South African Administrator General has finally released the all-important election law, which is supposed to establish rules for November's vote. But coming 5 months behind the schedule laid out by the UN Security Council, the law may be too little, too late to ensure conditions for free and fair elections. And a number of serious problems remained unresolved, including some spelled out in this recent Security Council document known as Resolution 640. First, the continued presence of Kufut forces. Resolution 640, issued on October 6, further demands the disbandment of all paramilitary forces and their command structures, in particular the South African trained Kufut. These troops continue to terrorize supporters of the Namibian Liberation Movement, SWAPO. Gwen Lister is editor of the Namibian newspaper.
I still think there are remaining concerns about Kufut, and obviously this is going to have to be very strictly monitored indeed, particularly in view of these recent attacks or targeting of certain people in this country.
Second, violence between political parties continues, especially clashes between SWAPO and the South African-backed Democratic Turenhale Alliance, the main political parties. Church groups report attacks on SWAPO by the DTA, now assisted by Kufut members, as well as SWAPO retaliation. Third is the issue of political detainees. The UN says that both the South Africans and SWAPO may be holding additional prisoners. UN Special Representative Mati Atisari says an investigation will continue, though visits by the UN to SWAPO camps in Angola and Zambia have found no evidence so far that SWAPO continues to hold prisoners. Finally, is the role of the UN itself. There are new concerns about the ability of UN peacekeeping forces to supervise the elections and questions about the role they will play beyond November.
I think they must remain in Namibia, certainly until such time as the constitution has been drawn up and independence has been granted to the territory. One is not quite sure of the role that the South Africans will claim for themselves after this time. To a large extent, I think the administrator's function has been completed after the elections have been held. And I would say the primary function of whatever is going to happen in Namibia should lie in this time with Mr. Atisari rather than with Mr. Fana.
South Africa Now continues to cover the shrinking coverage of South Africa. We have two stories this week. The first concerns Pretoria's version of South Africa Now, a weekly TV news propaganda show aimed at Americans called Inside South Africa. We questioned this program's backing in a report several weeks ago. Now, the Johannesburg Star reports that the South African government has admitted that they are paying for the show. On a more positive note, South Africa Now welcomes the arrival of Africa South, a new regional magazine published in Harare, Zimbabwe. The first issue carries a fascinating report on Cuba's late General Ochoa, who had been posted in Angola and was later executed for drug running. Africa South reports that Ochoa was also accused of defrauding the Angolan government and stealing some of its funds. The magazine's editor is South African exile Govan Reddy.
It's a serious problem of non-coverage of Southern Africa. The frontline states are even less covered than South Africa. To some extent that's understandable because apartheid is a big issue. But apartheid now is very much a regional issue. It affects all the countries in Southern Africa. It affects 9 other countries apart from Namibia, which is about to get its independence.
Did you want to stop here and take a picture?
No, it's okay. These pictures are good. I mean,
as we're
moving, it's a little shaky, but it's good.
Now all these men are going over to a hostel.
To a hostel?
Yeah.
And what's at the hostel?
Well, it's just like men staying there all by themselves.
Right. Because their families are far away.
Families are far away, right.
You're watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
With the release of veteran African National Congress leader Walter Sisulu and the recent meeting between F.W. de Klerk and leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, there's renewed speculation about prospects for negotiations between the government and the ANC. How does the ANC assess the prospects? South Africa Now spoke with Thabo Mbeki, External Affairs Secretary of the ANC.
To get to the position where one could say that the prospect for negotiations is getting close, there are certain things that would need to happen. The political prisoners would have to be released. Organizations that are banned, like the African National Congress and others, would have to be unbanned. State of emergency would have to be ended, things like this. If those sorts of things happened, then perhaps one could say, well, we are getting close to those negotiations. But as of now, there is a continuing confrontation between the democratic forces, liberation movement in the country, against the forces that are determined to perpetuate apartheid.
Mbeki explained the ANC position towards white rights under a black majority government in post-apartheid South Africa.
The positions of the ANC are very well known. I mean, even the Freedom Charter says quite clearly South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. It's very basic to the thinking of the ANC. And we have said, even in these documents that have now been adopted by the OAU and the non-aligned movement, that the ANC would support an entrenched Bill of Rights to protect the rights of all individuals in the country, all the democratic rights and human rights of all the people of South Africa.
Despite the recent moves and statements by F.W. de Klerk, which portray a kinder and gentler face for apartheid South Africa, Mbeki is skeptical.
De Klerk stood on a platform of continuation of apartheid. He went to the elections saying that he wanted to reproduce and continue the apartheid system. The claim that he makes that he got a mandate for reform and renewal is patently false, because he didn't seek such a mandate. And therefore I don't think there's any grounds for thinking that de Klerk represents a change in policy. I think one can even see it from the way he's even constituted his cabinet. It's the old hands, the old captains of the apartheid system that are there. And in the practice, he has actually done nothing to show any movement towards the abolition of the apartheid system.
The recent mass demonstrations which engulfed Cape Town were police and repression free. Still, Mbeki was not impressed with de Klerk's so-called concession to allow the marches to go on.
What is called allowing marches to take place was not allowing marches to take place. He had no alternative. Those marches, because they are part of the defiance campaign, would have gone ahead whatever de Klerk said. And he saw that he was going to lose in that confrontation, and he decided that he didn't want that confrontation, and then presented that as a concession. It wasn't a concession. He had no choice about the matter. The state of emergency is proclaimed by the state president. I mean, de Klerk had the possibility, if he wished to have issued a decree to say the state of emergency has come to an end. What's he waiting for? In the period that de Klerk has been first acting president and now president, a great number of people have been killed in South Africa, killed by the South African police while he was president. And therefore I'm saying that there is nothing that de Klerk has done which indicates that is any different from his predecessor.
The ANC has now been banned for almost 30 years. Inside the country, grassroots organizations like the Mass Democratic Movement, which include the UDF and trade unions, have taken a major public role in the struggle against apartheid.
The ANC is very much inside South Africa. The ANC is very much part of the struggle. You can look at any statement that de Klerk makes, for instance, about negotiations. And one of the things that is bound to say is that the ANC, for instance, must renounce violence, the ANC must commit itself to peace. There would be no reason for de Klerk to address the ANC, to make demands of that kind on the ANC, if he thought that the ANC was nothing, if the ANC was not influential, if the ANC was not part of the struggle. Certainly these hundreds of thousands of people who are conducting this mass open political struggle in the country. You can go and ask any one of them, and they will say the leader of this process is the African National Congress.
It should be noted that our interview with Thabo Mbeki was conducted before the release of Walter Sisulu and the other political prisoners. The ANC has since issued a statement saying that they welcome the announcement by FW de Klerk with, quote, great joy. They added, however, that there are hundreds of political prisoners remaining in South African jails.
You're watching South Africa Now. Coming up next, our culture segment, featuring the best music, film, drama, and artistic expression from Southern Africa.
We have two culture features this week. A new video by a Canadian artist who is concerned about apartheid. And our first feature, an interesting update on the Hollywood film, A Dry White Season, which deals with a debate over its violent ending.
The movie, A Dry White Season, is doing well in those theaters showing it, with reviewers on the whole praising the film. A Dry White Season has probably received as much publicity because of the minor role played by Marlon Brando as for its politics.
Mr. Dutoy, may I ask you how long you have lived with us in South Africa?
In an interview on CBS with Connie Chang, Brando says he's disappointed that the film isn't stronger, but South Africans we spoke to say his characterization of a prominent South African criminal lawyer is strong indeed.
The minute I heard him, I saw his moves. I had never met the lawyer himself, but I was sure it was George Bizos. I was certain of that.
There was a very strong resemblance to George Bizos, not only in appearance, but in his performance as well. I think that the part was played absolutely brilliantly.
Meet George Bizos. We spoke with him about his frustrations and experiences as a South African lawyer.
It has been an unhappy experience. But this has made us perhaps even more determined to work harder and unearth even more evidence and present it in a more convincing manner in order that we may achieve the result that we believe to be the correct one, and that is that truth should prevail despite the impediments put in our way.
Please sit down, Mr. Dutoy. I will take your case. I will take your case if only to make it abundantly clear how justice in South Africa is misapplied when it comes to the question of race.
Have you seen A Dry White Season?
Yes, I have.
And what did you think of Marlon Brando's performance? Was it based on you and was...
You'll have to ask the makers of the film about that.
But how did he do as a lawyer, do you think?
I think he did all right.
Yet the movie has prompted a debate among anti-apartheid activists who are discussing the ending, in which Stanley, the black cab driver, shoots a brutal police torturer. In the original story ending by Afrikaner writer Andre Brink, Stanley is forced to leave the country for fear of his life.
We had changed a number of parts of it, the ending, bringing up the characters in Soweto, scenes in Gordon's house, and we were very nervous. We thought, oh my God, what happens if he doesn't like it? We loved his book so much. He walked out weeping and said, this is exactly what I wrote. It's everything I intended. In the 10 years since he wrote it, the times had changed enough that all the changes we made is exactly what he would have wanted us to do. So it was a thrilling moment.
You needed that kind of an ending because the ruthlessness of this security man had been proven throughout the movie. And without that ending, it would have been almost fatalistic. It would have been such a negation of the struggle.
I was rather concerned when I heard about the ending of the Dry White Season story, because in fact, if one looks at the history of the protest in South Africa and the mass democratic response to the brutal actions of the government, and in fact the continued detentions, the continued torture, the continued onslaught onto the people in opposition, that in fact I think that does it an injustice, that in fact the people are really wanting a peaceful resolution to their problems. It was very, very realistic, and it was very close to the truth. I think
the end may have been jarring to many people, but living in South Africa and going through day-to-day persecutions by the police, it was, I'm sorry to say, not as jolting as it would have been perhaps to an American audience.
Inside South Africa, the film was granted a limited screening at the Weekly Mail Film Festival. The government's Publications Appeal Board allowed 5 showings of the film to people that the board described as unlikely to take to the streets in subversive rage. A small victory against censorship.
Thank you for watching South Africa Now. In a minute, the premiere of a new video by Frank, a Canadian artist who's concerned about apartheid. If you want more information about the issues we cover, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to South Africa Now, P.O. Box 1907, Canal Street Station, New York, New York 10013. South Africa Now is produced by Global Vision on a non-profit basis in association with the Africa Fund. On behalf of everyone at South Africa Now, I'm Fana Kekana. Thank you for joining us. And as we close the show, here's the new video Blood Bath from Frank. See you next week.